1 second. It's started. So hello everybody. Welcome to the SIG API Machinery, my weekly meeting. Today is July 15 of 2020, this wonderful 2020. And we have, for now, one issue on the agenda that we're going to discuss extensively. And now everybody can keep talking about the things that you were starting to talk about.
Sure. I guess we can start maybe by trying to collect a list of the questions that this issue raised. And
so maybe we should actually start by just giving an overview of what the problem is. The basic problem is that we block people from shooting themselves in the foot in some ways with webhooks, but it's still possible to come up with a webhook that accidentally acts on some component that's required to run the webhook. Like, it's still possible to make a self-defeating webhook. Basically, it's not safe enough to use the fail option. Is that a good summary?
I think there's different aspects to it that are worth considering, and then considering whether we think those are, like, it's not insufficiently easy or someone didn't take sufficient care. Right? So there are problems around rebootstrapping. Questions like, how do I know the list of resources I need to exclude? Can I exclude cluster scope? I think some of the questions in here were from a misunderstanding of the mechanisms we have today. There was another set, like another parallel track of questions that was a case of, if I want to have a webhook that watches almost everything but not everything, and I want to be sure that it's always called for when new types get created, how do I make that happen? And I think that's a slightly different problem, but one that was being asked.
Yeah, okay. Does anybody want to add more about the problem?
I can add a little bit of context. I filed the issue originally, so I feel like I should at least run up to that.
Thanks.
So I think the main driver that sort of got our attention on this was with network resources, where anything that's like a network resource that needs to do anything with the API server to like fix itself, like converge back to a healthy state, whether that's from like that bootstrapping phase or just like something happened and you have to change your subnets or something, right? But it's that case that I guess you mentioned earlier, that like the webhook requires some amount of infrastructure to work, right? And that includes the network. And so if that's broken, but fixing the network requires the webhook, you're stuck. So that's kind of the from the original like driving issue on this.
When you say you're stuck like that, is that like I guess there's two ways you could be stuck. Like you could be stuck in a negative sense, like the net webhook is failing, but if it ran and was a no-op, then it would succeed enough to get things running. Or it could be in a positive sense, like the webhook itself, if that doesn't get invoked, then the network doesn't get configured. So it's not good enough to just ignore the absence of the webhook. Like, it actually has to run for this thing to work. Which sense did you mean that in?
So it's I guess the one we ran into was that like it's fail closed, so it can't call the webhook and it just can't reconverge the network. Yeah, if there was any like mutation or something like that was required, then it's maybe different.
Yeah, I guess.
By the way,
I guess
closed is ambiguous in plumbing and electrical circuits. That means opposite things.
Sorry, yeah. In the fail mode for the webhook configuration. Right?
I guess another way of phrasing my distinction is: do you rely on side effects from the webhook to make things work?
No, not in this case.
Yeah, I think this is the negative case, Daniel.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know if we can solve the other case.
No, that's you have to edit the API server for that. No remote calls.
Yeah, so OpenShift self-hosts as well, and we also experienced the fact that there are often admission plugins for network aspects that run on pods, right? But you have to be able to run enough pods to be able to get running. And so the namespace selector is a powerful tool there, right? Where you can say, if a certain label is set, or we require that a certain label not be set to run this admission plugin to allow yourself to rebootstrap. Is that not sufficient for your use case?
So the problem, I guess, was with cluster scope resources. So there's stuff that's like that you don't have that like namespace labeling to help you out with it.
Okay. There's the idea of an object selector, which is the peer to namespace selector.
Yeah. So the problem, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, is that you don't have negative selection with that. You can't say select all objects except these four. You have to say select anything in this list of objects right now. And so it basically requires you to list out every object in the cluster you'd expect to see and want the webhook to trigger on.
I thought selectors have not match things. Is that actually?
They do. They have not.
You can select on things that don't have a particular label. So you could have like a break glass label or a exclude label, and unless an object had that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so I thought the problem was slightly different. It's not that you can't make a selector that says that. It's that the wrong set of people have the permissions to change the label.
Yeah, exactly. So there's like a few things going on here. So the one thing to clarify, so the object selector, I guess in my mind, I thought the type selection, but for the label selecting stuff, you can't always rely on like say Calico to generate objects with some set of arbitrary break glass labels, right? So like it's I don't want to say impossible, but it's very hard to use that as that mechanism.
So the object writer is not coordinated with knowledge that it needs to set a label.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are we making this impossibly difficult?
I was wondering the same thing, right? Like if you're managing the environment and you create a thing in order to support your particular mission plugin, in the act of doing that, adding a label doesn't seem onerous to me. Right, like you're already adding a registration for this thing, you're creating pods for it, you've labeled your namespace correctly.
The thing is, you might have to set those labels on objects that other components are making.
Right, and the initial create of that object is blocked. So it's not even that the thing shows up and you can label it and exclude it and put yourself in a good place. It's that to start the pod, as part of starting the pod, for example, a network plugin might create a new custom resource instance. And that creation would be blocked because the network plugin has no idea you need some special break glass label on it. And so you get yourself in a cycle where you can't set up the network for the pod.
Yeah. So it
still,
also
I
occurred to
think
me
it might be reasonable in that case to say that the thing, if a CNI plugin is making objects that have to work in order for the network to work, yeah, I think it's reasonable to say this CNI plugin needs to be able to understand it might have to add a label.
I think there's a trap that complicated systems get into where no one actor can unilaterally fix things. And if we require that the network plugin provider do a thing and the system administrator do a thing, then neither one of them can unilaterally fix the system. And that means individually they don't have quite enough motivation to actually do it, right? So I'm not saying that isn't an option, but it wouldn't be my first choice.
So in this situation where we had this hypothetical case where the creation of a pod required the creation of a resource that didn't have an admission plugin that worked until after the pod was created, this would be a problem that would not be resolved by the request for a *- resource match, right? Because because presumably if you were checking the resources that this network plugin wanted created, you would still want that to be the case. You wouldn't exclude that type.
No, that is the desired intent, is that the cluster administrator can say the Calico BGP peer object, I don't know if that's actually an object, just making that up, but like that they can say that thing is excluded from webhooks. Don't or it's not fail closed, right? They can have a webhook that says, best effort, try it. If not, I've prioritized keeping the cluster running to the policy enforcement, and then you can do auditing and sort of correct after the fact. But it's a matter of like priority for the cluster administrator, right? Would they rather the network be broken or potentially let something in that's missing owner label or something?
Sorry, I'm trying to get Max to show up. He's the person from the gatekeeper.
So one thing that Dan's comment prompted for me is like any of the places where we run the stuff on the own cluster is complicated by a whole host of things, not just this, right? Like escalation problems. So like, I want to run a network plugin. Well, I have to give it privilege, so I have to let it bypass PSP, which then leads to things like, oh, well, the service account token allows you to bypass PSP to run privileged pods or something like that. So there's like if this is a capability system, privileged thing has privileged capabilities, and it's very clear they have it. We didn't really design Cube like that, and maybe that was a mistake in retrospect. There's another question about a lot of the self-hosting stuff we run, or anything that you're running on cluster that's providing services to other things on the cluster. There is kind of this layering concept that our current mechanism doesn't deal with at all. I'm not proposing any specific solution, but it does get to Daniel's point. Like when you have a bunch of interacting things that you have to know all the implications of, you have created a complex problem that no individual thing can resolve. Is there a way for us to like spread the pieces out into distinct layers of
Exactly. That's where I was trying to go is when you're self-hosting, you don't want circular dependencies. What you really mean is a series of layers. So they're right, and that's where I was going with the label. Is the label establishes that this thing belongs in a lower layer. So it doesn't have to be labeled, but one way or another, I completely agree with Clayton. The critical idea is to have layers, and I think we should document them. Otherwise, everybody's going to be confused.
Well, we've tried a whole bunch of variations of like ideas around this. None will really stick, mostly because everybody's just trying to like keep everything running and get the lights on. Like last KubeCon, I had the rings and fences idea that some people run another control plane on somewhere else.
Yeah, the webhook documentation references run levels, which like was the idea that we had and never really propagated.
Right. And you can imagine something that like maybe there's a world in which you run two kubelets and one kubelet provides services to the other or something like that. Or the kubelet has two modes. Like there's a bunch of approaches that we haven't really dealt with. The multi-tenancy group, I think, is doing a breadth first search of the entire solution space of all of computing, trying to come up with something. And that is not a criticism. It's a lot of people bringing their ideas. Everybody has had good ideas in any of this. It's really hard for us to kind of approach it from the let's just add one more piece, to Daniel's point. And that's what I think we're kind of at the point in a lot of different areas of Cube is there's a lot of moving pieces. We're not making the pieces simpler, we're making them more complex.
So one idea I had, which I wrote up, and I think now is a good time to introduce it, is this idea of separating the roles. Like the webhook author knows what resources ideally the webhook should run on. The system administrator knows what operations are critical for keeping the system running, right? And maybe you don't want any webhooks to ever be avoided, but maybe there's some set of requests for which you'd really rather have the cluster work and have the webhook not get its guarantee. So one way of resolving this is to provide a way for the system administrator to just give a global exception list, like these sets of resources, these types, these namespaces, like some exclude list. Yeah, it does let your system administrator be evil, but you've got that problem anyway. This just makes it easy to fix the cluster while you're being evil.
The other thing I'd like. add to this, if I could quickly, is that we've never gotten FailOpen to work correctly. So for anything that is sort of control plane level, we need something where you can just say, look, I don't even want the webhooks called because FailOpen doesn't work, I think, reliably
And
enough.
by open, you mean allow.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
no, there's nothing. The problem with FailOpen, yeah, sorry, that's the words that we used. FailOpen means continue even if it works. The problem with FailOpen is that it's still, if the webhook takes a long time, that still causes problems.
Or if a
which
set
can be
of
fixed
webhooks take too long.
Yeah, which can be fixed with timeouts. So that's not like a fatal flaw. It's just a temporary flaw.
I don't believe it can, because if it were only one webhook, you can fix it with timeouts, but you don't know how many webhooks you have or could have. So I don't think timeout really.
Yeah, we could. Yeah, that's an interesting point. We could possibly. I think that's a separate question.
So I will say though,
we could have a global timeout.
Even that doesn't go far enough because, for instance, anyone running an extension on a node that grants a service account permission to do anything outside the bounds of like read-only is effectively breaking all the other security protections in the node, right? Like if you have a CSI plugin running as privileged and that CSI plugin also has a, like a service account token or the permission to go do something in that cluster, you also have that way of breaking what is a protected or not protected node, because if that runs on all nodes in the cluster, then all nodes in the cluster equivalent. So we have like three intertwined things: how to extend safely, how to self-host safely, and how to layer security safely, or layer capability or privilege. And I think we've certainly tried to solve each of these individually, and we've tried to solve two of these at the same time. Have we ever actually tried to sit down and create a structure whereby we could talk about all three of these without dying of exhaustion and starvation in the wilderness? I worry about that because like this is a hard problem, and no one in the last 6 years has been like, got it.
I'm not sure I actually understood what the scenario you were giving. Like what's the property that you're trying to ensure?
Like webhooks that can do privileged things are powerful. So if you run them on certain machines in the cluster, they're also powerful, and that machine then is as powerful. So anybody else who's as privileged on that machine as or able to see that is, and that also applies to webhooks.
You're worried about privilege escalation by getting co-scheduled on a node that happens to be running a powerful webhook?
Correct. And if you had a correct layering of roles, like a webhook that's like if webhooks, for instance, were designed in terms of the intent of the thing you're trying to protect, and you just don't protect against, that's fine. But there's a bunch of webhooks that are, this won't work unless this happens because another dependent component, that's what you're referring to, the unclear coupling between systems.
Yeah. So we've definitely discussed this previously. It's the whole like what should we call the control plane debate. I've maintained that the concept of what is unique about a control plane node versus another node, and in my opinion, it's a security boundary. It's not right. It's like you set up these nodes and declare that this set of privileged workloads is safe to run on them, but that's what makes a control plane node. There's nothing special about the node. It's a trust boundary, security boundary. It's like you want trusted things to run in it, sure. And so I think it might be useful to extend the concept, like, do you need more than 2 levels of trustedness, or would it be safe to run like all the webhooks in the trusted control plane nodes? I'm not sure. It might be useful to have stuff that's like not Kubernetes core, but also not random workloads.
But by the way, I run a workload that has its own trust boundary.
Yeah, this isn't too weird of a concept, I don't think. Yeah, so I don't know how to summarize the conversation we just had. Is it?
Well, let's choose which problem we want to try to talk about. So if the problem we want to try to talk about is making sure that the creation of cluster scoped things that don't know about the labels that need to be applied doesn't get stuck, that's one possibility. I mean, is that the problem that people are experiencing today?
Yeah, I mean that's the initial, like, you know, somebody's cluster was down and I came and filed the request for enhancement, right? I think that there, I guess my sort of initial thinking on this is that, like, I wonder how much of this we could, like, can we solve some of these problems, you know, like in, it doesn't have to be a single solution for all of this, right? Like, to say we give a negative selection or exclusion list, you know? Yeah, and I guess I mentioned that as like I don't want to necessarily like force solving that one problem to require solving all the, you know, and other related issues.
So let's focus on the problem of keeping the cluster running for a minute. Like there's some like trade-off between, like, well, do you want it to run if it's going to be insecure? But if we just talk about mechanisms we could add to keep the cluster running in the face of like some part of the webhook infrastructure is down. It occurred to me, another thought I had while reading this issue is like, we blocked you from webhooking webhook configuration. And if you think about it more generally, that's like a cycle of length 1, right? Your webhook can't operate on its own configuration. But you can have arbitrary sorts of cycles, and there's no way to express that in the system. And we didn't even make it configurable for like that's overly broad, and not that restriction is overly broad and not configurable. But what if there were a way to just specify all the components, list all the objects, like selectors for them, all the components that need to operate for the webhook itself to be healthy and handle traffic, and then we just exclude those particular objects from that webhook. Then even if you have like an arbitrary sequence of like, this deployment runs this pod, installs this thing, runs this other deployment, runs this pod, runs this a stateful set, runs this web, right? Like you can have an arbitrarily nested list of infrastructure that needs to be in place for your webhook to operate successfully. And maybe just a way of listing all the components, even the intermediate ones that are created by controllers, like maybe that would be sufficient.
Us already did that. Right, that's the namespace selector and the object selector. I think the combination of those two things allows that. But the question at hand is, what if there is
the issue is
it's created?
There's a couple issues with that, which is that it's overly broad. Like you might not need to exclude the whole namespace, and the other issue is that with the object selector is that the wrong set of people can set the permissions. The wrong set of people has permissions to set the labels.
Okay.
Did that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure I follow that.
Creating an object that way, I don't know that I would try to design an API in that manner, though. I mean, I would try to design it so that wasn't the case.
You're saying if you're in this condition, the webhook the webhook author made a mistake, or the system administrator made a mistake?
If you have a webhook, so resources, and as I recall, twiddle knobs for like all namespace things versus all cluster scoped things, although it's been a while since I looked at the API. And so
yeah, you can select, you can say intercept all namespace resources, or intercept all cluster scope resources.
Yeah. So when I think of cluster scope resources, I generally think of things that like your average user doesn't create. And so the people creating them, I generally trust to create them. And it seems a little bit weird that I would trust them to create them and not to decide, you know what, this particular one, I don't want you to run the submission plugin on. But
yeah, the thing is, OpenShift clusters have much more opinionated namespaces and cluster scoped resources in general than just plain vanilla Kubernetes clusters. So I agree that makes sense for your set of clusters. I'm not sure it makes sense for other for people who don't have like the project level of abstraction.
I think too that it still has the problem of relying on those generated resources to have the right labels, and like sort of saying broadly that like any controller thing you might deploy into your cluster has to know about this, and maybe
but you also never be able to enumerate those, right? So like in a I'm going to generate a resource thing, Daniel will never be able to enumerate a list of things not to run a mission.
Yeah, the way you list it would have to include something like a name prefix. Otherwise, you have the same problem. Yeah, or you have to get even more complicated. Like the name of the label has to match the UID of the object. You know, I don't think we want to be programming that into our webhook config.
I was a little bit lost, Daniel, a couple minutes ago when you're talking about something not having the too many maybe being authorized to tweak the labels.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other aspect of this thread about opagatekeeper, they have the issue where like they're enforcing some policy on the cluster, and suppose they exclude their own cluster scoped resource because they want to they want that to run. That lets somebody else set up an object that matches the same selector, and then it doesn't go through the policy engine and it doesn't get checked, and that's a problem for them. Right? So if you just make a selector, like you want to evade the webhook, you just match the selector and then you're good. That is great for the people making your cluster run, but it's also great for people who want to evade the policy.
So I see, yes. So that's why a label-based thing would be a problem, right? For something like that, you'd want to base it on something more particular, like namespace and name.
Yeah, it's mostly a problem for things that don't have namespaces, because it's already pretty common for the namespace scope things to be confined, and like then you can't change your namespace easily. But if you can make non-namespace, if you have permission to make things that aren't in any particular namespace, we don't have a good policy lever for constraining you to only being able to set certain things about those objects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, backing up a step, if it's the concern is this OPA gateway not trying to act on itself before it's ready, it can recognize itself by name.
Say that one more time. I was reading Walter's comment in the chat.
Sorry. Yeah. So if the problem is something trying to avoid acting on itself or other parts of the same, component, that they're all delivered by the same development team and they know what they are, they can identify these things by name rather than relying on labels.
Only in the programmatic invocation, which you can't invoke the webhook until it's ready. So the API that lets you tell Kube API server which resources should be intercepted does not have name-based interception.
Oh, well, geez, that seems like a simple oversight.
Are you sure you can't put in a list of names?
Yes.
Yeah, because that was granularity that didn't seem super important.
It also doesn't interact well with the way the cross product of operations and types and resources happens. So if you said, like if you add a name dimension to something which lets you list multiple types, it was a strange cross product. It also,
yeah, but we usually let people put in lists of such things so that any individual section has a reasonable cross product.
Yeah. The object selector was primarily to cover cluster scoped resources or opt-in, opt-out type scenarios. Doing name starts to sort of express weird things about objects in different namespaces. So if you say like exclude things named foo, like a foo in namespace A and a foo in namespace B have no bearing, like no inherent relationship to each other.
Sure, but for non-namespace,
No, you've got to put in a list where the cross product makes sense, right? You don't put a name and a wildcard on groups. That probably isn't going to do what you want. So let me ask it this way: who has appetite for a like per webhook exclusion list, right? Like right now we have like the things that you want to include. Suppose we made a separate clause that let you list, by some criteria, things you wanted to specifically exclude. I don't know, Jordan, David, you two specifically. I mean, I'm curious about everybody, but
denied lists have been really, really difficult for us to work through for other resources, because it means that in order to safely execute, you have to have read the full state, and any object reference that you have has to end up fully evaluated for you to be able to safely make a decision. So that if you can't,
I wasn't thinking of actual object references. I was still thinking about some sort of selection criteria.
okay.
Yeah, I don't know how it can work with actual object references, because how can you know what they are until you create them?
I'm going to reiterate what I typed. I mean, I like the idea, Daniel, but I really question who's going to know enough of the things that need to be denied, especially for some of the odd edge cases. Like, I can stop this all from working by forgetting to put an autoscaler's lease object in that list.
So that was going to be that you're asking the second half of my question for me, which was like if there's so there's things that you subtly depend on without realizing it, like if your webhook blocks the lease, then surprise, controller manager can't make the deployment that your webhook needs to run. And the list of such things is not visible to webhook authors, right? Because it might differ by cluster and how the control plane is set up.
Yeah, I was going to say it differs by cloud provider. It differs by version. I mean,
yeah, it could be very different. So, go ahead, David. I think you're.
Yeah, is we want the ability. We may already have some of this ability with you can list multiple registration blocks, but do we want to have different registration blocks so that we can say, like, in this particular namespace, or if we had a way to identify this theoretical cluster scoped object, this cluster scoped object, we want to have a failure policy of ignore and not deny, and we want to have everything else have the failure policy. So
you can do that. The question is the person who's setting up the registration for a random webhook going to know how to partition all of those things out?
So I can see how someone would make the claim that, like, when you install these 6 things, they get configured differently than when you installed only these 4. I guess I'm not completely convinced that I'm confident a cluster admin could do that.
So
Yeah, I think Daniel's alternative is an option to the API server that says, here are things that I need to run pods, and they should never be failed by admission webhooks, or maybe never even routed to admission webhooks. And to me, that sounds like a flag which is essentially make webhook admission APIs not work as advertised. So
yes,
it solves the problem of, like, who knows what all is required to run a pod? Probably the best person who would know that is the person setting up the cluster. So it solves that problem.
Yeah, let me respond to that. I think it's actually kind of a shared responsibility. Like, the cluster administrator knows some of the things, like all the weird things that they did to the cluster. Hopefully they know that. But if you're running some package like, I don't know, Calico or opagatekeeper, like, you may not have the time or inclination to figure out all the details behind running it. So I think the last idea I put on that, maybe it's not, but one of the ideas I put on that was, what if webhooks specified an exclusion list, and for each item they specified whether it would be useful to exclude that from all other webhooks also, and then the cluster administrator could put in a webhook definition, which was basically a no-op, and it just listed objects that they wanted excluded from all webhooks. It's a little strange, but yeah. So you're excluding it, and you get to decide whether you're excluding it from your object or other webhooks too, right? Like, because it's not sufficient to solve this for a single webhook. You can also have a cycle where webhook A depends on webhook B running, and webhook B depends on webhook A. Like, they're excluding each other, right? Like, just because you solved the cycle for each individual webhook doesn't mean you've solved a cycle when it crosses 2 webhooks. I agree that this is definitely a feature where you want availability over security. And I think people who want security shouldn't use this feature, and we should make it easy for them to know that they're not using it. That's my only response to your other point.
Hey, Daniel, I have, like, maybe related question to the availability, which you just pointed out. Is this basically the question which we are discussing about, like, exclusion of resources or like a bunch of other stuffs? Are we also thinking about how can we make, like, API server available even if the webhook is not available? So, like, API server just crashes after some time when we see that the webhook is down, on which basically API server depends on, right?
No, API server shouldn't be crashing if webhooks are down.
So even if the webhooks are down, you're saying basically API server still runs?
It does. It doesn't necessarily respond to, say, update requests. If it is required to make an admission webhook call, certain update requests could fail, but the actual health of the API server is still good.
If you're saying you're seeing stack traces in your logs, yeah, we print a stack trace when we return a 500 series error, and down webhooks might cause us to return 503s. But API server is not crashing; it's just trying to help you figure out what's wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, like, it's returning 503 when you say, okay, so you're saying basically, if I want to, I can exclude 503 from, like, restarting my masters or, like, the control plane.
No, it didn't restart. API server doesn't restart when it returns a 503 and prints a stack trace. That's not a restart.
Okay, so
if
basically,
it's a restart, we've got a big problem.
Okay, so basically we are saying that we don't have a, like, a hard rule that if a webhook is down, API server will be unavailable. Basically, it's not that what you're saying, right?
There's a difference between unavailable and the liveness endpoint.
Well,
right.
Yeah, I was going to say something like what Han said. I mean, there's a difference between it's unavailable and it's failing to proceed, right? You can easily make the API server unable to proceed because all requests to it will fail, but the API server itself is still up and running.
Also, admission only operates on write requests. So
Sure.
read requests continue to work normally.
And a webhook, a webhook that's not responsive is only going to block the request that is registered for, not all write requests. Of course, it's easy to make a webhook that hooks everything, but
I think regardless of whether we do some sort of exclusion, like documenting that, making your webhook intercept as few resources as possible to satisfy your webhook's job is better. So things like gatekeeper, even if we come up with a way to exclude, cluster critical, webhook critical resources, I would encourage them to compute like the smallest set of resources you need to intercept the policies that they want to enforce.
So I talked to Max a little bit about that, and it turns out in Gatekeeper, you can write a policy that operates on metadata, on labels, right? That's going to apply to every resource.
Sure, but if you haven't written a policy like that, then we shouldn't be intercepting everything just by default.
Yeah, so I actually proposed this, and the response I got was that I'm just adding an epicycle to the registration problem, because now they've got this dynamic webhook registration component that can go wrong, right? Like it's no longer a static registration. It's their webhook is managing its own configuration, or some controller is managing it on behalf of the webhook. And now you've got this like highly privileged controller that's twiddling with your webhook configuration bits.
That controller was already highly privileged if it controlled the thing that got to see every single write to the cluster. So like I don't be convinced by it's more privileged.
But you can't webhook your webhook configuration, and this controller is going to be twiddling your webhook configuration. So it's adding a thing.
But if the alternative is intercepting all resources and sending the payloads to this thing, then like what?
Yeah. No,
if it already has the most privileged view of the cluster data, like what else could it do? It couldn't make it more privileged than that.
One of my point was like it's extra network latency and everything to make unnecessary calls. So you should just remove all the calls that you don't need to make, but. Apparently, it's very common for people to have policies over their labels. So,
yeah, that doesn't surprise me. The example.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like getting started for all the tutorials.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it'd be good to get a sample of the room, and I can't actually see more than one of you at a time because I'm using the Zoom web interface. But who thinks that some sort of exclusionary something is necessary in webhook configuration or as part of the cluster, like just some sort of feature? You can +1 or raise your hand in chat or say something. I don't know. David, Jordan, I'm curious about you two in particular.
I am thinking.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. We can also just have this as a discussion and then circle back to the issue and put conclusions after we've had some more time to think about it.
So can we point to other cases of deny lists? I can point to one in OpenShift actually related to admission, where we can control who is allowed to bind other users, so that one person can't bind Joe into his own personal project without Joe saying, "Yeah, I want to be in that project." I mean, I guess I can say it hasn't been awful,
but I think your OpenShift clusters are not going to demonstrate the full problem, because you take a lot more care about cluster scoped object permissions. than vanilla clusters.
How difficult it actually is to implement, right? Like, was it hard? Did it fail often? Was it buggy? I mean, it wasn't too bad to build. I think I'd want to see how you tried to build the exclusion list. Like, are we going to be talking about manipulating the original admission registration? And so, like, if someone writes an operator to try to add their admission registration and they want to watch everything, are they going to have to merge in with whatever this cluster admin adds in this stanza? Is it going to be distinct? Because then I think you end up having object reference problems. Is it better than trying to do a series of ordered positive matching? So like in an audit log, the audit configuration for the QAPI server is a series of ordered positive matches, right?
Yeah, I don't like that actually, because it forces you to, like, if you're looking at item number 30, like, you have no idea what might have made it past that much of the list. I think that was not a good choice.
If we express it only in the webhook configuration objects, I'm skeptical that the original authors of those configurations will know what all of the random dependencies are on starting pods. So that's your point, that the cluster admin is more likely than a webhook config author to know. If we express the exclusions globally or in a API server config, that seems pretty misleading for like the webhook configurations. Like I have a webhook that I think, and until 120 or whatever, was effectively intercepting stuff, and now it like silently, magically doesn't on some clusters sometimes.
Yeah, that's kind of why I was thinking of like letting the webhook configs state their exclusions and also state whether they should apply to other things. So at least you can read the set of webhook configs and know what the exclusions are. And it lets I think there genuinely are two somewhat different actors that know this information. So it would be good if this information could be stated separately.
Which brings up the reference concerns that I had.
Or something similar to aggregated cluster roles, where and I think aggregated cluster roles sort of were a little strange because they use the same object both as a source and a destination. But
yeah,
if a cluster admin or a network plugin or like any actor with sufficient permission could indicate these resource types, or these labeled resources, or these named resources, or like there's several different ways to slice it, are required to bring up pods, or required to, they're in the critical path for starting pods, then that set of resources could be treated as something that a webhook could opt not to intercept. And so if we allow that registration, and then we let webhooks say, yeah, all the stuff in the critical path block, like, I don't want that. Like, don't intercept that. If we made that addressable from webhook configurations, that would sort of let webhooks configs opt into saying, like, whatever the cluster admin or whoever said is critical, don't send that to me. I don't know.
Yeah, like we could make this like arbitrarily complicated. Like, imagine a namespace-like concept that doesn't appear in the URL, but somehow you can assign objects into or out of this namespace, right? Like this could get pretty complicated.
Yeah, I'd like to avoid magic. So like having something in the API that says, yeah, I'm excluding stuff that is pod critical or whatever, and then something that is inspectable to say, okay, what does pod critical mean on this cluster? And then thinking about the personas like the network plugin author, the cluster admin, or webhook author, like, do they have a reasonable way to contribute to and inspect this information? I don't know.
There's maybe another another way of addressing this might be to introduce some sort of concept on label permissions, like if the primary problem with our object selector is that the wrong sort of people can set labels, then one possible fix might be to make it easier to control who can set what labels. I'm not sure I like that either, but
I did find the example from Jordan that like there's just no way for the other thing to know that it needs to put the label on it. It was somewhat compelling. Like it'd be a pain.
Yeah.
So I can see.
Yeah, I like the only way I can imagine this working is like service account based or something like that. Like what else do you have? Like everything else is user controllable. Like if you send a create request, the only thing the user can't fake is the account that they're using to send the request. So or I can imagine like having some sort of I could imagine like having a actually I guess you could do this today is you make a webhook that looks at the user that is creating the thing and sets a label accordingly.
Yeah, but that only works if the webhook's running.
Right.
So
one question to understand the problem a bit. So the thought came by somebody said right now. Would it help to be able to assign cluster scope resources to namespaces? Because I've had that thought so many times, like that persistent volume only belongs to that namespace. Why does it have to be not a namespace? Does it make at least sort of sense?
I don't know that I quite understand. Most of the time when you create a cluster scoped resource, it spans multiple namespaces.
So even a persistent volume, that example, like some persistent volumes are bound to persistent volume claims in particular namespaces, but an alternate mechanism is to create a pool of persistent volumes that aren't bound to particular namespaces, and then at some point in the future they get tied to it.
Yeah. Okay.
I think on the label bit is interesting, Daniel. Like if there was a way to address the issues of a creator not knowing it needed to set an exemption label, the only way I can see that really getting resolved is if there was like a built-in admission thing that would auto-label stuff. That's pretty particular and a little bit hacky.
But I wouldn't want that stuff persisted, right? Like I think as soon as we gave people like last person to touch this was, we will start seeing people develop features based on last person that touched this was.
Oh yeah, no, I wasn't thinking of doing it based on the user. I was thinking of like, I want to auto-label network plugin recorded usage resources with like run level 2 or whatever.
Oh, I gotcha.
And then you could say like, as a cluster admin, I know my nodes in this node group are this run level, my network plugin resources are this run level, my whatever, whatever they are. Here are all the things that need to be at this run level. And then all the things downstream of that, all your admission webhooks can start using your run level labels. You still need the policy to prevent random users from being like, yep, I'm definitely run level 2. Don't intercept me. So I know Tim Allclear has been looking into like label policy. So that might be something to tag him and or SIG into.
Conditional labeling admission plugin. The rules to describe that are not going to be fun. it'll eventually turn out
It could,
accept this Python
it
program.
it could be pretty easy, right? Like you could just make it a flat list like this user or maybe this group. If they create it, it gets this label or this set of labels. Would that be enough? I think that's pretty easy to describe.
I guess it's worth thinking about whether it would be enough for this particular problem. I suspect in terms of a general label or admission plugin, it's not what Tim had in mind.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd want to do a general. Yeah, I don't know. That sounds hard. I'd rather start with one that just solves the problem we have.
In time check, we have 2 more minutes, and I don't want to leave the conversation.
Yeah, I think this is a good conversation. This is obviously it's a tough aspect of the system. I don't think we're going to solve it today. So I'm going to finish writing down the problems we came up with in the notes, and I guess we can follow up in the mailing list and the GitHub issue. Anybody have any closing thoughts?
I could have been an electrician.
That's a great discussion, I think. And also, it's been around for a couple of meetings. We've been postponing it to have more time to think about it. So clearly, it's very fast. Okay. If that is okay with everybody, we can call a closure here. Daniel will finish up taking notes, and we can take it back on the next meeting and see what we can do progress on, how we can divide. Make sense? Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe and positive and healthy. And we'll upload it later to YouTube so you can repeat it. And we'll see you next time.
You can play this before you go to sleep at night.
Thank you. It'll help me get there.
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.